Center, the Smithsonian, the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is a fellow of the Harvard Corporation and a trustee of the National Gallery of Art, the University of Chicago, Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital, Johns Hopkins Medicine, Lincoln Center, and the Institute for Advanced Study. He's thinking, who is this?
And what have you all been doing with your lives?
Right, and I'm not done.
Oh, gee, okay.
That's enough.
He is one of the country's leading philanthropists, supporting many of the institutions that we've already named in the National Archives, National Park Service, the Library of Congress, Brookings Institute, and I have to say this with a pain, Duke University, I'm a Tar Heel, among others. David was one of the initial 40 individuals to take the giving pledge to donate more than half of his wealth to philanthropic causes. In his spare time, David moonlights as one of TV's most insightful interviewers on the David Rubenstein show on Bloomberg TV, which features his peer-to-peer conversations with American leaders from all fields. And tonight, he's going to interview our fearless leader, Attorney General Eric Holder.
All right, thank you.
And the New York Knicks have just announced he's their newest point guard. He just does everything.
So, Eric, thank you very much for coming this evening.
Sure.
Albert Einstein once said famously that the definition of insanity is when you do the same thing over and over again and think you're going to get a different result. But what do you think about the real definition being that you hang out with presidents of the United States and then you actually want to be president after you see how difficult it is? Isn't that... I mean, why would you want to be president of the United States? You've seen what, how difficult it is. You worked for Bill Clinton. You worked for Barack Obama. Why would you want to be president of the United States?
Well, I have not said I want to be president of the United States. I said I'm thinking about being president of the United States. But, I think every person who probably thinks about the job or thinks about seeking the job thinks that they can do it differently, that they can come up with innovative ways to deal with the problems of the time. And I'm probably a little insane.
All right, so you're thinking about it.
He was kidding. I was kidding when I said I'm a little insane. I'm constitutionally capable of,
All right, but you're thinking about it. So,
unlike some,
And how long will you be thinking about it?
Till the early part of next year.
All right.
But now I'm focused on November the 6th. Everybody get out there and vote.
Okay. So you have been very involved in campaigning for a number of candidates, but you've also been involved in trying to help with redistricting. You think that, in fact, we've had so much gerrymandering that it really keeps certain people from being elected, Democrats, particularly minorities? Is that your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the system that we have in place and that really got put on steroids in 2011, the last time we did redistricting, has resulted in states where you have these unbelievably safe districts where people are more concerned about a primary challenge than they are about a general election. Right. And therefore, representatives at both the state and congressional level don't have to do things consistent with the wishes of their constituents, and that leads to gridlock, it leads to cynicism, and it leads to an attack on democracy as we think it should exist.
So you were recently, unfortunately, the target of a bomb. Didn't get to you, but it obviously was sent to you. So were you shocked that you were the target of that, and are you shocked that this kind of thing could happen?
Yes and yes. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you can't expect. I heard about it, and I was getting ready to get on a train to go to Philadelphia. And my security, folks with me, and you think that that's adequate enough. But then you hear about a bomb that got sent to my office. And that raises, concerns. I mean, when I was Attorney General of the United States, I used to ride around in an armored vehicle. I still have, security, but you like to think that as you kind of transition out of an official position that those concerns might decrease. But that was kind of a rude reawakening about, what people might want to do.
So recently, 11 people were killed in a synagogue in Pennsylvania, and under the federal statutes, this is now a hate crime prosecution, so the federal government is pursuing it. If you were the Attorney General now, would you pursue the death penalty for this individual?
I'm a person who's opposed to the death penalty. I am concerned about the imposition of the death penalty Chiefly because we have a justice system that, as much as I said negative things about it, is probably the best one in the world, but it's composed of human beings who have the ability to make mistakes. And as we've seen, there have been a number of people who have been on death row who have ultimately been exonerated. And so that's why I'm against the death penalty. Now, if this case were to come to me as Attorney General, you have to put aside your personal concerns and make decisions about whether you'll seek the death penalty. And I don't know all the facts of this case. I don't know this person's background. But on the basis of what I know now, I suspect that I probably would approve a recommendation to seek the death penalty, in the same way that I did with regard to the Boston Marathon bombing.
Okay, so let's talk about your background for a moment. You grew up, as we heard earlier, in Queens, and then you went to Stuyvesant High School. You got a special, I guess, scholarship when you were younger. So you went to an advanced intermediate school, and then you went to Stuyvesant, and you were the captain of the basketball team. Did you think you were an NBA potential?
Yeah, I thought I was.
But,
the NBA didn't seem to think so. I thought I, could maybe walk onto the Knicks or something, but
didn't work out.
Walt Frazier, Earl Monroe, and Eric Holder. That was going to be the deal.
All right. So you
It could have worked. It could have worked.
Well, you might have maybe practiced a little harder. You might have made it, but.
No, it wasn't a matter of practice. God didn't give me what I needed.
I thought I was going to be a professional baseball player until I peaked at the age of 6, and then I realized it wasn't going to happen. I also realized nobody Jewish plays in the baseball league. But,
That's not true. That's not true.
There's one or two, but mostly
Greenberg?
they're more Jewish owners than players, right? Probably. So, but Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax, a few. Okay.
Well, they were kind of all-stars,
They were
all-time
great.
greats,
I know, but in the last few years, not as many. But okay, hope springs eternal.
All right.
So. You went to Columbia College and you went to Columbia Law School. And after you graduated from law school, why did you not go to a high-paid law firm and get wealthy working for a very famous law firm?
It was interesting. I had clerked at the Justice Department after my second year. I'd clerked after my first year at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I just was drawn more to public service. I wanted to do things with my law school degree that I thought would advance the cause of justice, help people, as opposed to, going to a firm, which, it's interesting because I've been at Covington now. This is my second go-round there. And although, we are focused on representing clients, there's a lot of pro bono things that we do there that are consistent with those desires I had coming out of law school.
Right. So you left New York, the cocoon of New York, and you went to Washington.
Yep.
And you worked in the public integrity section. So was it hard to find people to prosecute under the public integrity section? Was it hard?
No. It was the public integrity section was formed after Watergate, and it prosecutes official corruption cases, political corruption cases, and it was, let's say, a target-rich environment. I traveled around the country prosecuting public officials who took bribes, extorted money from people.
Did ABSCAM, or were you involved in that?
I was involved in one of the New Jersey component of ABSCAM. So, there was, and it continues to be a kind of a target-rich environment.
Okay. So after you did that for a number of years, you were appointed to the Superior Court in the District of Columbia. So lawyers don't get paid that much.
By Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, right?
By Ronald Reagan, I mean, that's something that the Republicans say. Dutch put me on the bench, guys,
So the compensation for lawyers is not that high in the government, but the compensation for judges might even be lower in some respects. So you didn't worry about any of that?
I didn't worry about it a lot, but my wife said that, I married you and you're working your way down the economic ladder of success here. And she said, I didn't sign up for that. Like, what's the deal here? And get like what's...
But your wife is an OBGYN, right?
Yeah.
So she had to deliver a lot more babies to pay for everything, right?
Yeah, well, she had to deliver quite a few babies. And she did deliver a lot of babies. And in Washington, D.C., I'm really known as Mr. Sharon. People all love her. She delivers babies with nothing but happiness, good news. Me, And so people will come up to me and say, hey, aren't you Eric Holder? I go, yeah. You're married to Dr. Sharon Malone. And I go, yeah.
Well, when you're married to someone who does that for a profession, people in the middle of dinner, she gets up and goes, in the middle of the night, just has to leave, and isn't that disconcerting at times?
Yeah, although by the end, she's not doing OB now, she's doing GYN, but I could handle most of the OB calls, that she'd get in the middle of the night. I would know, how far apart are the contractions, no, I think you could probably stay at home for another couple of hours here. And there were other little female issues that I became familiar with, and I would know what to prescribe.
Okay.
You know? So she would sometimes take the night off, and I would just say, I got this, you know.
All right. So
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
you don't really have a license to practice medicine, but
Hey, but I learned. I learned.
Okay.
So, like, you know.
so how far can the contractions be before you have to go?
I don't really remember now.
All right. So, all right, you're on the court, and then all of a sudden, somebody says they'd like to make you the U.S. attorney. Mm-hmm. And was it a Republican or Democratic president?
Bill Clinton.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So did he meet you, or who appointed you to be U.S. attorney?
It was actually pretty interesting. What he said was that he was going to give Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is our representative to Congress. We don't have voting rights in Washington, D.C. Everybody, please support us for that. Exactly. She opened up the process and said that she formed a committee of, I guess, 16, 17 people and just said whoever wanted to be U.S. attorney should just apply for the position. I had been on the bench for 5 years, and I got really kind of worn down by what I had to do on a day-to-day basis. This is at a time when Washington, D.C. was the murder capital of the country. We had the highest per capita murder rate. We had the crack wars going on. And I was taking young black men and putting them in jail for periods of time that were, I thought, too long with these mandatory minimum sentences. So I wanted to get out of there and really be a part of a process where we might change enforcement decisions.
Well, when you're the U.S. attorney, you're prosecuting people who, under these laws, you might put in jail. So you found it easier to prosecute than be a judge in some cases?
Well, see, as a judge, you're a referee in the middle of a game where I still wanted to be a player, and all you can do is deal with things that are brought to you. If you're the U.S. attorney, you can make decisions about who you're going to arrest, what policies you're going to put in place, where are you going to deploy law enforcement resources, and you can impact the intake that goes into the criminal justice system.
So Washington, D.C. at the time was a majority African-American city, but you were the first African-American U.S. attorney. So did that strike you as strange that they never had one before? Or?
Yeah, I mean, when I got to D.C., I guess in the late 70s, it was, commonly called Chocolate City. And it's not as chocolate as it used to be. But it struck me, it was really kind of strange. You'd see on the wall of the U.S. Attorney's Office the pictures of all my predecessors. They were all white men, no women before me. And then there was this little chocolate drop, that was me. And there has, since that time, been more diversity in terms of African Americans and women who have been U.S. attorneys. But it was a strange kind of thing.
So you must have done a pretty good job as U.S. attorney, because then they say to you, how would you like to be Deputy Attorney General? Isn't that a big step up from being U.S. attorney? There are like 60 U.S. attorneys, and only one of them gets to be Deputy Attorney General. So were you surprised when you got offered that, or did you kind of think you deserved it?
Oh, I clearly deserved it.
Right, okay.
I mean, I clearly deserved it. I mean, in my own mind. Actually, well, yeah, it was, I wanted to do it, but that was probably the toughest job I think I ever had, in that the Deputy Attorney General is kind of like the Mikey of the Justice Department. Remember Mikey, in that commercial, give it to Mikey, he'll eat anything. Anything the AG doesn't want to do, you give to the Deputy Attorney General. The Deputy Attorney General is kind of like the COO of the Justice Department. On a day-to-day basis, you're responsible for running DOJ from, do we have enough pads and pens to making decisions about who should be appointed a federal judge, all kinds of things, pardons, all kinds of strange things that you have to do. And it was the most physically demanding job I think I ever had.
You mentioned pardon, by the way. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the Clinton administration, there was a pardon that you are said to have signed off on. Did you sign off on the pardon of Mark Rich, or you didn't know anything about it, or how did that get done?
Well, let's see. How much do you all know about that? Because I can say, what are you talking about? I know what happened. Yeah, no, that was one that I didn't focus on enough, and didn't seek information from the person on my staff who was actually responsible for handling pardon matters. I gave kind of an equivocal answer about whether or not it should be granted. I was going to be acting Attorney General for President Bush, and there were big concerns about his inaugural parade, and so I wanted to get out of my office to get up to the command center to talk about the measures we were going to put in place to keep him safe. So that's when I blew that one.
Right. So you went back you went to practice law at Covington and Burling afterwards, and you're practicing law, and you're doing well, and you're making more than as a judge, presumably, and more as a U.S. You're doing better. And your wife is.
My wife thought I was taller,
right,
better looking,
right, okay,
funnier.
Right.
Had nothing to do with the fact that I was making substantially more money.
So you're doing that, and then all of a sudden, an African American gets elected President of the United States. Did you know Barack Obama before?
I met him, I guess, after he had been elected as a senator but before he'd been sworn in, we sat next to each other at a small dinner party. And I thought, until maybe about 3-4 weeks ago, it was serendipitous that we just happened to sit next to each other. But the woman who was the hostess brought together, I guess, about 15, 20 people to meet this new senator so he gets to know some people in D.C. And she said that she sat us next to each other, and we kind of hit it off. He's got this mistaken belief that Chicago sports are better than New York sports. So, we got through that. We worked our way through that. And he had done things in criminal justice as a state senator. I'd done things as deputy attorney general. And then we just kind of, as I said, just hit it off. And I would go by his office every now and again.
So after 2 years in the Senate, he says he's going to run for president of the United States. Did you tell him that was crazy?
No. But I went to Iowa. He called me up to see if I'd work on this effort. And he was about a quarter of the way through his pitch. And I said, look, come on, Barack, I'm in. Let's do this. Now, to be honest with you, I thought that this would be something idealistic, something that was worthwhile. I thought he was extremely qualified. But I wasn't totally sure that this was going to work. I went to Iowa for the first time, where I had crowds as large as, 300-400 people. And I remember sitting in Washington, Iowa, in a library with 3 people. So, like that.
Very diverse place.
Very diverse. And the people with their notepads, and they're taking notes. 3 people. They got like a zillion questions. And I remember coming back from there and telling him, I said, there's something going on. We could actually win this. And he said, duh, that's why we're doing this, so I was like, all right,
So he gets elected president. And did you expect that he was going to call you up and say, thank you for helping me get elected president because of what you did in Iowa and you could be attorney general? Did you expect that? Or?
Well, let's just say there were conversations that happened at a lower level. I didn't have directly with him, where I was kind of given a couple of choices of things I might want to do. And I said, I think I can help most being AG. And actually, that's the thing I'm most familiar with. I know the Justice Department.
Okay, so you got that job. And when you got it, you did it for about 6 years or so, the third longest period, as we heard earlier.
Do you know what number 1 is?
Wait.
There you go.
Yes.
William Wirt, yeah.
I know, about 11 or 12 years, but
Right. 2 presidents.
second was Janet Reno,
Yeah.
and you're number 3. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
So next question is, you were the only cabinet officer in history to have a criminal contempt citation and a civil contempt citation by the Congress. Did you regard that as a badge of honor, or did you really worry that they were going to prosecute you in some way?
No, I wasn't too worried about getting prosecuted because the people who would have to make that determination worked for me,
That wasn't going to happen. Okay.
Oh, no, that was a joke.
They
looked at it, I'm sure, they looked at it totally objectively and made a decision
Right, okay.
not to
But
prosecute their boss.
what was that all about?
It was all connected to this thing called Fast and Furious, which was a really kind of a dumb idea that some people had to let guns walk. Means that you sell guns to bad guys, and instead of arresting them immediately, you let the guns walk. It was a program I didn't know anything about. When I found out about it, I stopped it. But the gun lobby, for whatever reason, decided that when Darrell Issa and his band of merry men wanted to hold me in contempt, that they would score the vote, and so a whole bunch of Republicans voted to do that. But in some ways, it was factually accurate because I did hold them in contempt. I mean, I did have contempt for Congress, or at least the Republican members, so there was some degree of accuracy there, I suppose.
Okay. So you did Attorney General. You left before the administration was over. You went back to Covington, Burling, and now you're practicing law, but you're thinking of being president of the United States or running for president. Let's talk about criminal justice for a moment.
Why the laughter? I guess I have 2 people who are not supporters here.
Well, on criminal justice,
Yes.
The mass incarceration that began in the late 60s, and when people were basically saying we had locked people up and 3 strikes you're out and so forth, do you think that ultimately was racially discriminatory, and was the real purpose of it, was to lock up people who were minorities who really didn't have the same advantages that other people did? Or
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think if you look at these tapes that have recently been unearthed about Nixon, I guess, towards the latter part of his time, or maybe the early part, he talks about this notion of being tough on crime and with a racial and political angle to it. I don't think it was necessarily carried on with racial thoughts. I think there was racial detachment from what was going on, in the sense that people were not paying attention to the fact that huge numbers of African Americans, Hispanics were going into jail at rates that were, quite alarming. If those people who had been going to jail were white, I suspect that we would have had a different view about those enforcement policies. I think back to the time when, crack was the drug that we were trying to deal with, and African Americans, Hispanics were involved in that, and we had a criminal justice solution to that problem. Now, as we're dealing with an opioid crisis, and I think the approach we're taking now is a right one that involves far more white people, we are looking at this as a public health issue, and we do not have as much of a criminal justice approach.
So, when you were Attorney General, did you go to federal prisons very often? Did you ever meet with prisoners or wardens, and what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, it's interesting. I did not go to a federal prison while I was Attorney General. I did go to prisons when I was a judge. And I talked to people who had actually come out of jail. I remember walking down the street one day, and a guy came up to me and said, "Hey, Judge Holder." And I'm thinking, yeah. And he said, "You sentenced me to," and I'm thinking, oh, man. And he said, he thanked me, because he said, "I got my life together. You didn't give me as much time as you could have given me." And I was thinking to myself, thank God. But the thing that really struck me was that he said, "I'm trying to get my life together, and if you helped me before, could you help me now? I'm trying to find a job." And that was the thing that he was most concerned about. He said, "I don't want to go back to the old ways, but I don't have a way to support myself." And that really, I remember that stuck with me when I became AG, that I thought we needed to focus on preventing people from getting into the system, rehabilitating people once they were in the system, and then coming up with a reentry plan for people coming out of the system.
So you grew up in New York and are African American. Did you ever think that you could have gone the way that some of the people who went to jail did, that you maybe had some lucky breaks, but did you ever think that you might have gone the wrong way, or did it ever worry you that you might have gotten involved in the criminal justice system?
No, I wasn't worried about it in that, I had a strong father who would have done harm to me if I'd done anything inappropriate. But there are guys who I went to elementary school with, junior high school with, who did end up in the system, who ended up with drug problems or, criminal involvement. And, I could have been with them at an inappropriate, while they were doing something inappropriate, I could have been swept into something like that. So I don't think I would intentionally have been involved in anything. I could have been, at the wrong place at the wrong time.
But have you ever found like you were stopped for traffic or something like that, and people looked at you and you thought because you're African American you were going to get arrested or something like that, or is that?
Oh, I got stopped twice on the New Jersey. I got stopped twice on the New Jersey Turnpike for driving, too fast. I had a 1971 Plymouth Duster that was incapable of speeding. Interestingly enough, when I was Deputy Attorney General, we ended up settling a case against the New Jersey Highway Authority for pulling over African Americans for no reason other than the fact they were driving while black. And I took kind of a real satisfaction in solving that case, given the fact that a young black guy who had a huge afro and all of that stuff, but I was like, weighed 150 pounds. I wasn't threatening anybody.
So what is the greatest pleasure of being Attorney General? Is that people laugh at your jokes more? You give you short putts? What is it that they do?
All of that stuff is true.
Restaurant reservations are not a problem?
That's also true. And, I miss the people, I miss the work, but I miss my plane. There are 5 cabinet members who can't travel commercial, and I was luckily one of them. And so the ability to just get on a Gulfstream and go wherever you needed to go. I remember I had to do something in California one day. I remember leaving Washington, D.C., doing whatever I had to do, and I was home in bed, that night. I miss that. I love Delta.
So that is
not United. I love Delta, but I still miss my plane.
So this is the real reason you're going to run for president, because
I want a bigger plane.
Right, bigger plane.
Bigger plane.
So what would you say today if today you had to write your own obituary and you were going to say,
ooh.
Well, Alfred,
after last week, this is kind of a touchy question.
So, if you were to say, what would you want people to think about you and your life, and what you're most proud of you're having achieved today?
I'd hope people would say he was a guy who devoted his life to trying to make this country more fair, more just. Didn't always succeed, but he was always attempting to, make our democracy better than it had been, something like that.
Okay, and you have any regrets about not ever going into private equity? The highest calling of mankind? You've never regretted that?
On a daily basis,
Daily
I
basis.
do. On a daily basis. And my wife really regrets I didn't
Okay,
go into
all right.
private equity.
So we have time for some questions. Any questions of the Attorney General? Raise your hand.
I think we have some microphones.
Raise your hand, use a microphone. Here's one right here. Stand up and get a mic or speak loudly.
As a criminal practitioner, predominantly in the federal system, as a criminal defense attorney, I recognize that you rolled back a significant number of Bush-era policies. Unfortunately, they've gone now in the opposite direction. But more broadly, nationally, in terms of beyond criminal justice, if you were in a position of authority as president, what policies would be your priorities to roll back that are occurring now?
You know, I think we as a nation have reflexively fallen into a posture where we put people in jail for far too long. I mean, as an old prosecutor, I think people need to be held accountable for what it is that they do. But the sentence that people receive should be commensurate with the action, you know, the crime that occurred. You have people in our federal system now who are serving, 15, 20, 30-year sentences, who were people who had, substantial amounts of drugs on them because they were couriers, but they were not kingpins, And so I think rolling back the amount of time that people have to serve, changing our criminal justice system so that we're looking at ways in which we prevent people from getting into the system, understanding there is a social component to this. When I was a judge, the number of people who I had to send to jail, you'd get all of the material that, it was like a pretrial, called it a pretrial jacket, all the material about a young person who'd be before me for sentencing. And in too many cases, I saw kids who had been in the abuse and neglect system in DC. And, they were on a path that, if, as Carol said, if somebody had intervened at an early age, they might have had a shot. But because no one did, and they, just found themselves in the abuse and neglect system, there was almost like a graduation to the criminal justice system. And so focusing on those kinds of things, which at the end of the day will save us money, keep us more safe, and, we will not have wasted lives. I mean, the stuff we heard today, about this great young man. I mean, there are tons more people like him who, if given the chance, can make major contributions to, to our country, but they're not given the chance.
Any other questions, right?
General Holder, thank you for coming here tonight. I happen to be at a table with a lot of Dutch people, and as you may know, the Netherlands, thank you. The Netherlands...
Hey, Netherlands in the house.
Exactly. There's a lot of criminal justice reform there, as you know. I'd love to know, we're talking a little bit about the future and potentially your future role. You mentioned in your opening speech evidence-based programs. A lot of that is about education, educating the American public about the very different results of the different programs, incarceration, or a program like this, and there's so many of them here in the US and abroad. What would you be doing differently to educate the American public about the staggeringly different results and return on investment for the US public?
Yeah, I mean, I think people who have, or in positions of power need to use the, the bully pulpit that you get as president, as attorney general, to speak truth and to talk about the ways in which things are done in other countries that are, as safe, more safe than the United States, but don't have these huge kind of industrial complex incarceration systems. But you have to keep pushing that out there because it's an easy thing for people who are legislators at both the federal level and at the state level, and who have to run for office every 2 years, every 4 years, to show that I'm going to be tough on crime. I'm going to be tough on crime. I'm going to keep you safe. I'm going to be tough on crime. And the way they do it is to increase the number of penalties, the maximum penalties. And that's why we called our program being smart on crime. And so I think it is really, using the ability that you have to access the media to push out facts. I mean, we have to reacquaint ourselves with facts generally, Facts are good things. And then we've got to use that reconnection with facts to push out specific things about criminal justice policy.
Do you think there are enough Democratic candidates to choose from for president next time? Do you think there'll be enough people running for president?
I don't think so. I don't think that. I think every registered Democrat, as far as I know, is running for president in 2020.
Okay. All right, another question right here, and then back there here.
What would be your goal, and how would you attack that problem, which is ultimately at the root of most of the other problems?
Yeah. So there's a lot of presidential stuff here. I haven't said I'm doing this now. But I think first of all we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that because you're poor, you're more likely to be criminally inclined. That's simply not true. All right. And I'm not saying that by way of criticism. But there's no question that if you are poor, if you come from poverty, you're going to be exposed to things that people who don't have those economic concerns that may, could push you in different directions. And so we have to, there are glaring issues that we have. There are glaring economic inequities that we have. I happen to think that government can be a force for good. Bill Clinton famously said that the era of big government is over. Well, I think that the need for good government endures. And I think that we should not hesitate to use government in positive ways. Lyndon Johnson was criticized at the time, and I guess now even people talk about, the Great Society and all the programs there and how they were all failures. And that's not necessarily true. Some programs didn't work, but a lot of the things from the Great Society are things that we now take for granted. Head Start, Medicare, Medicaid, all these things. So I think there's a role for government to play. And I think we need to look at those parts of our country where we have seen poverty endure, whether it's the inner city or it's Appalachia, in West Virginia, and really kind of tailor solutions to those areas. Why do we have poverty here that in spite of the great economic progress that we've seen generally for the nation, why does poverty continue to exist in certain places? Now, we have to also face some realities here that there's a racial component to some of this. And that means that this nation has to be willing to ask some hard questions of itself and face some difficult truths, and not, take the path of least resistance, which is to kind of ignore things racial. So I think there's a whole bunch of things that have to go into the solutions for those problems. And we also have to understand they will not be solved over the course of one administration. Even if that administration is 8 years, you can make progress, but we're talking about dealing with issues that were long in the making, and it will take, probably a long period of time to undo.